Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today is another guest making their official debut here on the channel. Now, as a teenager, my guest wrote short stories for pleasure and relaxation. And during those years, his writing style developed due to authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien, David Eddings, Isaac Asimov, Agatha Christie, Stephen King, and others, which are too numerous to mention. With over 20 years of military experience, my guest is also well versed in business and formal writing concepts and methods. And as a former columnist and staff writer at a local newspaper, he has penned over 40 outdoor related articles. He's also published several full length articles for magazines, including local history articles, parenting columns, and articles in both China and Uganda. And fantasy and sci fi hold a special place in his heart. And my guest has published 5 YA fantasy novels and 1 horror collection. And sharing his passion for writing and the written word is a joy. And over the years, he has mentored both aspiring and established authors. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, Mr. Mark K. McClain. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
No problem, Mark. Now, I have to say, you have had quite the pedigree. You have been doing a lot of writing over your years. So, before we dive into one of your stories, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
No, I don't think so. The only thing I will say, as far as viewers or listeners are, I am like any other author. I greatly appreciate reviews, just fans, anyone that follows me and reads the book. I highly appreciate all of them, and it's I don't think that gets said enough. I don't think readers really know the impact they have on writers. It's yeah, it's definitely a symbiotic relationship between the two, and I thank every one of them.
Absolutely, 100%. Now, I know you actually have another book coming out soon, which is The King's Ascent. As a brief teaser and introduction, what can you tell us about this book and what we can expect from you in this book?
Well, this is the third book in the series, and it's the first time that I've ever tried to write middle grade. So
Okay.
the whole series was an experiment for me, and it was how can I put it? I had to tone down some of my writing because you don't use as big of words, and
Right.
the whole premise and the whole thing is a completely different. Uh, it's a completely different ball of wax, more or less. And I had such a blast writing it. And the first one came out, and I was happy with it, and then it just kept progressing from there. And with this one being the final in the trilogy, the final book, I found that it's almost bittersweet getting to the end. It's hard. It seems kind of weird to say, oh, I'm never going to see these characters again, or I'm never going to. This is done. It's over, and it's moving on. So it was. I'm very happy with the writing in the third one, especially. I love my cover. I love everything about it. I'm very excited to get it out soon.
Awesome. So before we dive more into The King Descent as well as the series itself, let's talk a little bit about you, Mark. So in your bio, you've been writing short stories for very, very long time, and you were inspired by a whole bunch of authors. So is it safe to say that you were a creative person growing up?
I I don't know if creative. I have no ability to. I'm lucky if I can draw a straight line with a ruler. So art artisan was out for me. So the thing that really hooked me was the very first book I ever read by myself was um, excluding Dr. Seuss and things like that
Hmm.
was and whoops, we have a We have a visitor. Um,
Another cat. You're
uh,
fine.
so when I read The Hobbit, I was that was it for me, literally. I knew that I fell in love with his descriptions, his beasts, his creatures, his characters, everything. And I said, I want to write like that. I want to write. So I knew from the time I was 8 that I wanted to put words to a page.
Absolutely. And what would you consider your aha moment in the sense that you want to take your passion for writing and possibly build a brand from that? Because I know you've worked in other aspects of writing. You were a columnist, you were a staff writer,
Mm-hmm.
you've also done other types of writing. So you've already established that aspect of you. But what about the author side? What would you consider your definitive aha moment for that decision?
Um, well, once I retired from the military, I realized even though I was starting um, a new career, because I retired young. I retired when I wasn't even 40, and I
Mm,
retired 39 when I retired from the military, and that was 21 years. And I thought, what am I going? Now what? So I started working jobs, but then the writing bug began to bite me, and I was thinking, I can write in my spare time. So it just kind of went from there. I started taking courses. I started um, nurturing a love of writing that I already had, and then I realized how much I loved being an editor as well, because I just love the written word, everything about it, whether it's creating it, editing it, and I think that was just basically the moment. Once I retired, it was, now what?
hmm Absolutely. And that makes, complete sense. And actually reminds you of someone else I actually had on the show, like the very similar mindset where, they were also in the military. They've already had like established their field in writing in the technical side. But then it's
Mm.
like, well, what do I do from here? I mean, I have all this skill. How can I apply it? Now, they went the route of an editor because that was their specialty. They specialized in editing, copy editing, federal documents, government documents. So they had that experience. And all the kind of same thing about you're telling me, Mark, that you already had this expertise in writing from the technical military standpoint, but that writer's bug never really went away. And that just pushed you down this path, which I think is really incredible. So now let's talk about your books and how you went about creating these numerous books, your YA novels, your horror collection, and this middle grade series. So, let me ask you this. What was the first book you published? And from there, what were your goals that you had going forward with that book, as well as the promise you're making to your readers? And has that transferred over to your other series that you've written over the years?
Well, the first book, I think I'm like several beginner. Now we're going back a few years. I think I'm like several beginner writers. Is my first book wasn't that great. Honestly, let's be honest. I have a lot of experience. I had most of my experience came from military writing, things of that nature. So when I actually started to sit down and create this was a YA book, I was being coached because I took a course, and my coach was invaluable to me.
Mm,
She was telling me, strengthen this, you can do it this way. Now you have to figure it out on your own, but
right.
still, the guidance is very welcome, which is what I try to carry over into my coaching and editing practice. I try to nurture instead of just saying, no, this is wrong, go back and do it. You have to explain what is wrong, etc. So I learned a great deal from having a coach, and then that that book that I created, then I look back on it thinking that's very amateurish. I can tell that
Mm,
it was the first book. And then, like anything else in life, the more experience you get, the better you become at it. And now And that was under a different pen name. I actually dropped that name and picked up. Um, I started using McClain because it's my mother's name, my mother's
Right.
family's name. So I switched over to my pen name as Mark McClain, which is my brand. And I
Mm.
just, it was just a way of honoring my mother because she's been gone for years. And it was just something that I thought it would be fun. So with that said, again, each book is progressively, I think, progressively better.
Mm.
And the third one in this series, The King's Ascent, is, I think, the best of all three.
Absolutely. And I know the feeling as well as, like, as we progress with our books. When I wrote my first book, I was still in graduate school and I knew little to nothing of the
Mhm.
writer's journey. And now, working on my fourth novel, I think I've now realized that my writing has definitely improved. There are still some things that I still need to work on, but that's the thing about the writer's journey, that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we only get better as time goes on. So now, jumping forward. So after you've written the first draft of your first book, what was the overall reaction like from friends and family? And I don't know if you did beta readers or ARC readers, but if you did, what was their reaction like? Was it very positive, overtly critical, or somewhere down the middle?
It was. It was. Well, generally, I'll put a caveat in there by saying I do not involve friends and family. I think
Okay.
it's a bad mistake for a writer, mainly because if you look at it from a friend and family perspective, if somebody brings you a book, they're going to do one of two things. They're going to tell you it's great whether they like it or not, just so because you're family and they don't want to hurt your feelings.
That is
So
true.
you could literally write something that is just nonsensical, and they might say, "Oh, that's really good." So, and the same goes with friends as well. They don't. You have to have an honesty, uh, trust amongst who you're giving your book to. So I
Absolutely.
generally will not ask family or friends for any feedback. I don't. Um, I have a gal that I mentor right now, and she has her own business. She's doing outstanding. I use her as an editor, and even
Mm.
though I'm basically, she has taken off on her own, and she's got her own thriving business. So I have her edit. That way, friends, family, everybody I know is out of it. And yes, I do use beta readers. In fact, if you looked at my LinkedIn feed, you will see that I actually advertise, "Hey, I have an
Mm.
art copy of The King's Ascent coming out. If you want to get in on it, that sort of thing." So I am constantly having my book read, and by the time it gets out, it's probably about version 11 by the time it actually comes out.
Absolutely. And I'm also in the beginning stages of that. I am still in the beta reading phase of my fourth book, Decimus, The Wolf of Rome. And I'm trying to get all that, taken care of, as many edits and revisions it needs to be before I send it to my editor, which you probably have some thoughts on this, that for authors who are using beta readers and ARC readers, ultimately their end goal not only is to, of course, leave reviews and give critiques, but to get the book as polished as possible before you give it to the editor. Because, and you may agree with this, or you may have some thoughts on this, is that when working with an editor, you want your book to be as close to the finished product as possible. So that way the editor, they still may find things to change or work on, but it's not going to be as long and tedious if you have, let's say, a specific a date that you have to have the book up.
Right. I do. I agree with that. You're saving you're saving yourself a money, actually.
Mhm.
In other words, if you do two versions of your story and send it to an editor, it's probably still going to be really rough. So they
Yes.
are going to go through and just, for lack of better terms, they're going to pick it apart.
Right.
Not that they're trying to be mean, it's just their job. So they're picking it apart, telling you what's wrong, and then you have to keep doing that back and forth until you get a version that is actually publishable. But if you do it near the end, when you're really satisfied and you have gone over it so many times that you don't even want to look at it anymore, then you send it off to your editor. Because I normally get that. I know that sounds terrible, but I normally get that around version 9. It's like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't read my own work anymore. It's like, I don't want to read it. It's just, I'm seeing the same things over and over. It's confusing. Send it to the editor, and they don't see half the things that you were worried about to begin with. So,
Absolutely, 100%. So, looking back on all of your books that you've worked on, would you say that your goals and promises for each have been validated by your readers and fans over the years?
I have not, everyone, I don't think there's an author out there that doesn't get a comment that they could do without. Like this is clearly a middle grade story, but
Hmm.
yet one of the critiques, even though they gave me a good critique, the very opening line was not a YA book. Well, I know that. You already know it's not a YA. I put right on there it's middle grade.
Right.
So I think they were disappointed because they were expecting, so they mark you down. And then some people just don't like your work. And it's okay. If they give you a 1 star, then it's something that you have to live with. You just don't pay attention to that, because if I have 1 1 star and 15 4 stars or 5 stars, I'm good with that. It's when you have a balance that you start to worry. If you have
Absolutely.
20 reviews and 10 of them are 1 stars and 10 are 4s, then you have a problem with your book.
Mm. Yeah, that is very, very, very true. I also think another thing that, authors really need to consider is, not have a strong attachment to their book. And I'll give some context for this statement, which also leads into this question. So I'm sure you'll definitely agree, Mark, that as authors, we imprint a part of ourselves into our book, whether that's, a certain character, or maybe it's a theme we've always enjoyed, or something. We open ourselves and we leave ourselves vulnerable in our books. And because of that vulnerability, we're exposed. Now, when we go about publishing it, in this day and age, social media is a huge blessing to authors because it allows us to meet so many readers from across the world, as well as make connections with fellow authors and writing groups. On the other side of the coin, we do leave ourselves exposed to trolls, hate speech, spam, negativity, and so forth. And ultimately, that increases the anxiety and hesitancy to either continue writing or continue being an author or anything in particular. And furthermore, imposter syndrome is always going to be there in the forefront. And I think at that crucial moment, it's going to come out to play and really try to mess with you. So, Mark, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is that have you ever had moments of heightened anxiety or imposter syndrome when it came to your writing? And if so, or if not, what disciplined you to continue writing, to create different series, to showcase who you are as an author?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, I I would say anybody that says they have not experienced imposter syndrome either is not telling the truth, or they have not tried to publish anything uh, because of that. The
Mm,
imposter syndrome holds them back. Yeah, of course, I've experienced it. I don't think there's an author out there that puts fingers to keyboard that says, "Who's going to like my writing? Is anybody going to write this? Why am I even writing it?"
right.
Just all those thoughts go through your head. Perfectly normal. And I tell that to all my clients that come to me. Don't let imposter syndrome smash you down into the mud and keep you there. It's you have to take a chance. You're going to have to. I call it releasing your book baby. You
Mm,
get to a point, just like when I say I can only read my own stuff about 9 times, then I have to pass it along. It's the same cycle. Is you can only do so much, then you're going to have to launch it. If it turns out to be well liked, good for you. Then you build on that and you keep going. If it doesn't turn out, going back to the scenario that we used where you get mixed reviews, then you know that you have learned a lesson, and you can, even bad reviews can give you a hint about
yes.
what. So some authors literally, like Stephen King, I know he says uh, some of them will ignore, they totally ignore the bad reviews. I don't mind reading them because they will say, well, the character wasn't developed enough. Great, that's helpful. But if they're the only ones that see that, then I disregard it. But if I get 4 or 5 saying this character wasn't developed far enough, or the story jumped around too much, or something along those lines, there you have it. There you can solve it. But for imposter syndrome, holy cow, that is a very tough hill to climb. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Beginning, and unfortunately, to your point on social media, it is. Personally, this is going to sound bad. I despise social media, and I say so because of the points that you brought up with the trolls and the. I try to block all the trolls, all the hate stuff, all that. And the only thing I want to read about when I open my feeds are writers, editors, that kind of thing. Everybody
Right.
else, I get rid of them. So there is a very strong community out there. Just join it, engage with it. The problem is another problem with social media is you have people giving advice that they have no idea what they're talking about.
Absolutely.
And a lot of beginning writers read it and think, oh, I should be doing it that way. So that's it. Social media is wonderful in some respects, but it can be your death as a writer in other respects, because it literally overwhelms you to the point of, I don't even want to write anymore. That's what some beginning authors, the stance they take. I can't write anymore. I can't even figure out what I'm supposed to do.
That is very, very true. That is very, very true, Mark. And that kind of leads into a later question down the road in this interview. But before we get to the business portion of being an author, there is one question that I did want to ask you, Mark. And this actually comes from a previous guest I had on my show, Jasmine Young. Shout out to her for this. And on her feed, she posted that, in the last 4 years, specifically during the quarantine lockdown era, it was a traumatic time for everybody. But
Mm.
in those despicable 4 years, you had something beautiful come out. And from her response and her statement, it was a golden age of creators. And she specifically talked about indie authors. And as I read more about it, she actually has some points. A lot of authors emerged during the quarantine era
Mhm.
because they want to break away from the monotonous that was happening in their daily lives. And I can 100% vouch for that, in my opinion, because almost all the authors that I've had featured in the last year and a half have all been from that time during the lockdown and quarantine. So, Mark, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think there is a golden age of indie authors that has emerged from the quarantine era?
I do. With To a certain degree, I do. There are, like you said, a lot of creative types use
Hmm.
that to say, I don't have to go to work now. What am I going to do? So you have artists popping up. You have I don't know how many businesses popped up. You have
Yes.
all the solopreneurs started popping up. In fact, I'll be honest. That's about when I started really diving in deep to my editing business. I had an editing business, but once COVID came along, I really increased my attention to it and really started trying to build it as a business. And I think a lot of people were in the same boat, and that goes with writers, and that it's like any other field. I think some people, and this will be tough for some people to hear, but you can only teach writing to a certain degree, and then the author has to take over. And
right.
because some people, again, and I'm not trying to insult anyone, but some people lack the skill to ever be a writer. It takes a skill. Just like I can't be an artist. I will never be an artist. I cannot draw. Like I said earlier, I can barely draw a straight line with a ruler. No way I could be an artist. I don't care how I practice. I don't care what I did. I couldn't be an artist. I'm not a plumber. Okay, it's that kind of thing.
Right.
So some people just have to face the fact that writing may not be for them. Now, can you get guidance? Can you get help? Absolutely, and that's what coaches do. And that's one of the favorite parts that I have about my business is the coaching. And going back to the COVID part now, you take all these people that are sitting around with lockdown, and you had some really amazing writers come out during that time. And I'm not just talking traditionally published indie authors. There were some fabulous indie authors that just popped up out of nowhere. So it was kind of a 50-50, I believe. There was some books that I will probably never read. And then there were other ones like I can't wait to get my hands on that one. So it was definitely a boon for writers, and it continues to this day.
Absolutely, 100%. I was definitely part of that boom because I wrote my first book, The Gathering, which I have next to me. I wrote this when I was still in graduate school back in early 2019, and just before lockdown truly began. And that was just to help, break the monotonous. And then once it got into 2021, 2022, I wrote my second book, which was Asimov, Son of Persia. And then also wrote two more books, with my last one being before I graduated, Michael, Last Angel of Earth. And it's crazy how the industry has pretty much got a boom to it during those 4 years, because you're right, indie authors they've always been on the rise, but I definitely think during those 4 years, independent authors really skyrocketed to really match the forefront of hybrid and traditional authors, which now leads into the business portion of the interview, Mark. So when you began your writer's journey and you began publishing your stories, which publishing road did you take, which was the most beneficial to you, and what have you learned from it?
Well, that's actually a heartbreaking story for me because
Okay.
I put a lot of effort into finding a publisher. And I found one. I finally found one. I signed a contract, 3-book deal. We were working through it all. I got just to the end of the first book, and they went bankrupt.
Oh no!
So my contract was gone. The publisher folded. All the editing I've done, everything, that it was just a complete wash. It was down the drain, and that was heartbreaking for me because I was so excited to get it put out there to the public. And ever since that happened to me, and I know this sounds like sour grapes, but ever since that happened, I went to indie author, started my own imprint, and I will probably never attempt to be traditionally published again. And plus, there's a plethora of benefits to doing it both ways.
Right.
Unfortunately, the traditional publishing is even gone downhill. It's there because indie authors are becoming more prevalent. They can't do what they used to do. In other words, they don't have a monopoly on the system anymore.
Mm,
You didn't get through one of the big five, you weren't getting published back in
that
the
is
day.
true.
You just didn't. You forget it. You didn't exist. But now they are losing so much that even their books, if you will notice, if you pick up any book off the shelf from one of the big fives, I think even the editing quality has gone down dramatically.
Interesting.
Because I have looked at some of the newer books that I have picked up recently, and I read through them and think, who edited this? It's you'll see repetitious phrasing, words, scenes that are kind of almost, some of them are chopped in half and then they jump. It's really it kind of takes the wind out of my sails to want to go to a traditional publisher. Plus,
Right.
all the hoops you have to jump through to get there is so.
That is
I
one.
just think that's the way. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying indie works best for me. I have experimented both ways, and I believe having total control of my book, what the cover is going to look like, because that one's a big one for me. I loved the covers back in the 70s and the 80s. Loved the artwork on the book cover, and I try to bring that forward in mine. I just, it's something that really sucked me in. So, but you don't have that if you go traditional. But indie, you can do whatever you want.
That's absolutely true, Mark. That's absolutely true. And that's actually a nice perspective that I don't think any guest has ever talked about that. The traditional industry is going down because, you're absolutely right that it's hard to get into the big five, Macmillan, HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, Tor, Forge, Simon Schuster, and all these others. And from their point of view, I can understand that, for them, it is a business. They really have to understand like what books can make money for them, because if they're going to put money into a book, they got to get some kind of investment back. And unfortunately, some books are hit or miss for these companies, and they get shelved very quickly. And that's why I've been talking with a lot of authors on this question, whereas some of them, again, they go the independent route, but they sometimes go the independent print house, where these print houses, which are small, but they've had a record that lasts a little bit longer than, the big five, and they have a very strong community, which I think is an aspect not a lot of people take into consideration, as well as hybrid publishing. I know people have always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with that aspect of publication, but I've met with a lot of authors who said that it worked best for them. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's whatever works for that individual. Yes, you can be a self-published author for your main series of books. You can also go traditional to an independent house for another series of books. It's whatever works for you. But I definitely think, and this goes into the next set of questions, is really understanding the business side and really marketing one's book, especially if you do go the direction of indie, because it's all on you. Finding the cover artist, that's all on you. Finding an editor, that's all on you. Marketing your book, that's all on you. Formatting your book is all on you. And that takes a lot of time and money because you have to balance out everything. So now let's actually talk a little bit about the other aspects of the business. First and foremost, let's talk about the readers and the audience. Now, the audience is the main target goal for all authors. And when we write our books, we are the target audience first and foremost. But again, with publication, that's where we have to consider, okay, who is this book really marketed towards? What's the audience? What's the genre? And so forth. And sometimes that is a hit or miss in that regard. So, Mark, looking back on all of your books, do you have a good idea of your audience for each series? And also, in your opinion, when should an author consider their audience? During the pre-writing phase or the marketing phase?
Oh, you have to know it from the very beginning before you even basically set a word to a page. You have to know your audience because it basically guides you to the word choices you can have. Like we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
like you cannot use adult words on a middle grade book. I'm talking about 9 through 12-year-olds. I
Right.
just can't start a really heavy, thick text that they have no experience with or they would never understand yet. I mean, obviously, if they're going to grow up being readers,
Hmm.
they'll they'll get onto them eventually. But your words cannot be overly obviously no sex, no drugs, no
Yes.
anything like that. All that's out. Whereas in adult novels, it's almost expected. Not
Yes.
necessarily sex or anything, but you're going to have a much more increased violent. So there's a total difference. You have to know who you're writing for. You cannot write a book. I tell this to clients too. You cannot say I want my book to appeal to everybody. That's an impossibility. You
Yes.
cannot do that. You must pick because the point you brought up is the most valid. Is you're going to have to choose sooner or later. So if you're it, you have to do it from the beginning. You can't wait till the end and say, "Oh no, I wrote an adult book, but I meant it for middle grade." Then what are you going to do? You either have to market it as an adult or you're going to have to go back and redo a majority of it to get to a middle grade level. So you absolutely have to know it before you begin.
Absolutely, 100%. And kind of leading on that, looking at the readership in particular, because I definitely think the readership is arguably the harder target group as opposed to the audience, because the audience is a very wide and large pool. But the readership, those individual people who are going to pick up your book, is very, very challenging. And that, of course, comes down to the specific age category: middle grade, YA, NA, and AF, which has their own set of rules, their own expectations, and so forth. And I talked with a lot of authors who have written in all four of these, and they have said it is a challenge to
Yep.
really make sure your story, fits in those specific categories. But then I've also talked with authors whose books kind of, what's the word I'm thinking of? They cross the line into other age brackets where you have young adults who can read this story, and you can have adults who can read this story. And I think that is a very difficult thing to do, to have a book that's not really marketed to any specific group, but what's the thing I'm thinking of? But you want it to be enjoyable. You want it to be engaging. But as you also said, Mark, it's not easy. So coming back to this question, what have you learned about, being, YA author as well as a middle grade author? And at any point in any of your stories, did you yourself kind of run across these issues where you realized that maybe one aspect of the story you were writing was marketing, or rather veering into other readership groups like YA, NA, or AF?
Sure. And as a matter of fact, when I started writing the Ruinous Curse series, it started out as YA. And then by the time I got done the first book and put it out and began the second one, I was thinking, I probably mislabeled that. And I actually had to go back because
Mm,
I didn't I didn't ramp it up as much as I wanted to get to the YA readership.
right.
But I had a very solid middle grade story. And that's one nice thing about being an indie publisher is I can just go back, I can change with a click of a button, I can change the category, and voila. And now I've got a middle grade book and it goes up on the website as middle grade instead of YA. But like we talked about, I definitely had it in my head when I started. It was a YA, strictly YA, right YA. But by the time I was done, it was, you have to be willing to be flexible, because if you're not flexible and say, I made a mistake, this is not YA, I'm going to market it as middle grade. If you're not that flexible, you're probably going to have troubles.
Yes.
Now, Harry Potter is, even though I'm going to pick on that series for a minute, because it is one of those books that nearly anyone that likes fantasy or magic can pick it up and read it and enjoy it. It's just the way it is. I don't care if you're 60. I don't care if you're 6. If you can read it, you can pick it up and you get something out of it. You enjoy it. Obviously, that is an impossibility to plan for. Like,
right.
She even admits that she did not. Rowling even admits, I had no idea it would take off the way it did. It was supposed to be a scholastic middle grade book, and then the next thing you know, it's a worldwide phenomenon. You can't predict something like that, but you still have to have it ironed out when you start. How am I going to market this? Is it going to be middle grade? Is it like she could not have done that as an adult, as an adult version. It wouldn't have. It's borderline YA. I would say it's a pretty solid entry into YA, but for middle grade, it's well, you know exactly what happened to it. It's phenomenal for the middle grade readers. It's perfect. They relate to the characters. It has all the magic. It has the little love triangles going on. It has everything that you need in a book. It was still needs edited, but it was well written.
Definitely. I also think what also makes, these kind of books very fascinating, especially now in the modern industry, and I talked to a lot of authors on this, is that each of those reader groups, it's almost like has its own identity in a sense. It's an expectation if you go into, like, I know especially for YA, there's a lot of spice and open and closed door romance, and some people, initially that was fine in the beginning, but now it's like the dominant feature in YA. And a lot of authors who've gone into YA have wanted to veer away from that and try to do something, that's a little bit different. That starts like a palate cleanser when it comes to books. And I definitely think, when trying to make a book that's different yet familiar is another challenge, because, and again, shout out to another author and another guest on the show, Eric Bowden, because this is really probably a very profound thing that I learned from his interview, which is, when we talk about individuality, an author's identity and their story, we also talk about, what are the books that led to the creation, its formation. And, every author is going to have, their set of authors who have really helped them hone their skills. But what is important is that at the end of the day, when someone picks up, your book, Mark, or my book, it's going to be our words. It's not going to be Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, Brian Sanderson, or anyone else. It's going to be us. Yes, there are going to be some influences here and there, but at the end of the day, it's our own stories. And another thing that I would like to hear your thoughts on when we get to the question is, for a lot of books that I've seen, they've had this tagline, so-and-so meets so-and-so. From a reader's perspective, that's going to be engaging. Actually, probably the best example I can give for that is probably one of my favorite books, the Dinosaur Nights series by Victor Milan, the late Victor Milan. And it says here by George R. Martin, it's a cross between Jurassic Park and Game of Thrones. Now, I've never read either of those books, but I instantly knew what to expect upon reading it, and I was not disappointed. However, I definitely think as authors, we shouldn't be pigeonholed into one category. Now, a lot of authors have their own opinions on this. Some people like to be referred to as, this specific type of author, whether that if they think of me as a fantasy writer or YA author, I'm going to take that as a compliment. Others, not so much. They don't like to be pigeonholed as solely just that. And it ultimately ties back to this huge thing about individuality and respect to source material. So for you, Mark, here is the question. For your writing in particular, how have you been able to balance these two, your identity and individuality as the author in all of your books, which are very, very different, but still have you in it, but also showing respect and reverence to not only the genre, but the various books that led to the creation of your own?
I I think that's another excellent question. I think all there's not a writer that writes that does not infuse themselves into a story. Like,
Mm,
in fact, I think I even did a post on this not too long ago, but it was, for example, you may have a character that maybe you're afraid of spiders, so
right.
your arachnophobia is gonna carry over into one of your characters. Maybe you're gonna make your character just scared to death of spiders. They don't like crawly things. So your parts of you go into every book that you write. And I will debate that until the end of time, because there's not an author that doesn't put themselves into their words on a page.
Right.
It can be something as that, maybe they're a very Zen person and they're just easygoing and they just breeze through life, and that's the kind of character they are. And they get thrown in with somebody that's high strung and angry all the time, and they have to find that balance where they can coordinate. There's just so many ways that you can take a story when you infuse your own self into it. And that's like, for example, I am really, really, really anti-bully. I do not like bullies, and I never did. And I infuse that into my stories, and I make it to where you'll have. So what are you doing back there? You'll have some people that infuse their likes, dislikes. Where I draw the line is like political content. I do not put
Right.
political content. Obviously, it's middle grade. It wouldn't get it anyway. So, with that said, I very much put. In fact, my proofreader tells me that all the time. She says, I can hear you when I read these lines. I can hear your voice. So I have accomplished that mission then if I infuse myself into my stories. And and I don't mean that to be like narcissistic, like, oh, I have to have part of me into that story, but you draw on life experiences to help you write.
Mm-hmm.
And what better way to give yourself a powerful story than to infuse your not only your own personality, but your own fears, your own likes, all that. That's what makes compelling writing.
Absolutely, 100%. And that also leads into how we market our own books, like what are very important to us. And especially now going back to social media, there's been those posts that authors make, is like the tropes and the themes. And a lot of authors have a love-hate relationship with that approach to marketing, where it has like all these different clicks and tropes and themes. And while that is good, it doesn't really tell us what the story is. Now, again, that is a whole discussion in of itself, but it definitely ties into this, mentality of how we go about writing our books. And this is a nice little introduction question before we get to the probably the biggest one of this portion, Mark. So, as a icebreaker for that, how would you always help like a client who's like writing in the sense that what are like their first goals? Like, how would you help an author who's really trying to figure out what kind of writer they want to be, whether they want to just write just as a hobby, like it's something they just want to do, as opposed to having that commercial mindset where they want to build their brand and build who they are as an author?
Well, I actually do that frequently, actually. I volunteer my time for the VWP,
Mm,
which is Veterans Writing Project. So, being a veteran myself, I help other veterans or members of their family learn to become writers. So they will send me their work, and I edit it. All this is for free, and a lot of them will work through PTSD that way.
mm,
It's very beneficial. So to answer your question, to guide them through that, um, I think I think you basically just have to get down to what they like and they don't like.
right.
And I know that sounds really simplistic, but it really is that simple. Like, what appealed to you when you pick up a book? What are you looking for? Are you looking for horror? Do you want romance? Do you want erotica? Do you want fantasy? What do you want? And soon as they pop an answer out, and I said, that's what you should write then, because if that's what you are most familiar with, that's what you should write. Now, that's not saying don't write anything else, because I write horror. And even though fantasy is my main, I write horror because switching your mindset like that, from going from fantasy to horror, is not only difficult, but it's very beneficial, because you have to think in a totally outside the box thing from what you're used to. Here's my little comfort zone in my fantasy box. But once I get outside that, like, oh, can I write anything else? And you have to teach yourself all over, and it really helps your writing. That is probably one of the best pieces of advice I can give a beginner writer, is is if you get stuck on a story that you're writing, try writing something totally different. Totally
Mm,
different. And if you're writing fantasy, write romance. Even if it's only a chapter or two, get your mind out of the fantasy. And then when you go back to it, it'll be for the better.
absolutely, 100%. And this now leads probably to one of the biggest questions I have, like in this interview. But I'll give some context to this question because it's a pretty big one, a really thought-provoking one. And again, context to this, I've been doing this show now for about 7 years and interviewing authors. I think now I've interviewed, out of 292 videos, 123 authors, and I've learned a lot from many people. And these authors come from every walks of life, every background, every point of their journey, where they're just starting out as writing, they haven't published yet, they have already published, or they're now returning to the industry, whatever reason that may be. And I've learned a lot from them. And from these lessons that they've given me, I've come to learn, in my own opinion, there are two paths as authors: to be an author and then to be known as an author. One is dedicated to the art of storytelling, the other is dedicated to marketing and building capital.
Mhm.
Ultimately, both have the end goal of literacy, acclaim, and so forth. However, I've also talked with a lot of authors who have said the dangers, especially for first time authors, that second path, to be known as an author, is the most enticing, but it leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and
Mhm.
expectations.
Yeah.
Because you probably tell your clients this, who want to get into this industry, is that this is not a get rich quick money scheme. It's not something like you can make a career of just like that. Would we all like to? Absolutely. You would have everyone leaving their jobs and becoming writers, but realistically, that's not a case. It's a grind, it's a hustle in the beginning before you can even establish your brand as an author. And it leads to this hard truth. In this industry, it's a 50-50 chance if your book is going to be a success. Granted, there are others whose books are not only successes, but they also win a lot of awards. And that is not an easy thing to do for a first time author with their debut novel. That is a huge achievement. But generally speaking, it's a 50-50 chance. You're going to have highs and you're going to have lows. And if you try to make this your industry, or I should say, if you try to make this your main source of income, your passion for writing is going to plummet because you're no longer interested in the craft of writing. You're just trying now to write for either a trend or something that's popular in the publishing industry. So, Mark, here's ultimately the question. What is your thoughts on this topic, this discussion? And while it is true that in this industry, it is a 50-50 chance, it shouldn't stop somebody from honing their craft as a writer, as an author, if this is truly the industry they want to commit to.
It, I totally agree with the, in fact, I wouldn't even say it's a 50-50 chance. I think it's far less. It's more like about 20-80, because your chances of going out on your, now, remember we talked about earlier, especially during COVID, there are some amazing writers out there. So I can easily see how someone could write a book and put it in, start winning awards straight away. That's great, because they are good writers. They were just kind of closeted, more or less, during like, I don't have enough time, I can't do this, I can't do that. And then once they started writing, now they're winning awards and everything.
Right.
I couldn't be happier for them. But the ones that aren't winning awards, it is a tough haul, especially knowing that you have to do your own marketing and whatnot. I would bet 80% of the people that I work with, a lot of them don't wind up publishing at all, ever. They give up, because, again, like we went back and talked on social media, there's so much information that they almost feel, because I'll get clients all the time say, well, I read this and I read that, and I said, disregard that, because that is not the way life works. You can't, that's not the way the writing world works. You're not going to be able to just put a cheap cover on your book, not get it edited, put it out there, and then expect to get some kind of income from this book. You are not
Absolutely
out of it. You're going to have to stop that mindset right now before it gets started. So I think it's more along the lines of, it's a slash between confusion and being overwhelmed. And that's why people get stuck, they quit, it's as heartbreaking for them to have to quit than it was for me to lose that publishing contract. Mark, I'll be the first to admit, I am not a very good marketer. I suck.
Same here.
I am not. But I do have I have my books in bookstores, and that's gone from knocking on doors. I go to the bookstore and I'll carry my books in and say, can I put these on your shelf? And some will say yes, some will say no. And that's just part of the human connection that you need to make. The human network is invaluable. And I don't think a lot of that human network comes from social media. I think it comes from knocking on doors, things like this. It's just, your name will get out there sooner or later. If you are looking for, like you said, that basically a get rich quick scheme, you're in the wrong line of business.
Yes.
You're in the wrong business, because it is very, very tough, especially, I can't remember the number, so don't hold me to this. I'm gonna round it by saying millions of books are getting published on Amazon every year.
Yes.
And your chances of being found in that quagmire is, you have to be able to market yourself, because if you think you're going to put it up on Amazon and all of a sudden you're going to have 500 reviews or 500 readers, you'll be disappointed.
Absolutely, 100%. And also going forward with that, and something that we talked about before is, in this industry, it is an industry to grow, because you only get better as time goes on. Grit transforms into talent. And it may be your 5th book, that book that you really get your name out there, or maybe your 20th book. Whatever book really gets your name out there, that's okay. Because then you can tell your readers and fans who have been with you since day one, saying, hey, if you enjoyed this book, check out my others to see my growth as an author. And I definitely think also in the industry, networking is imperative for indie authors. I mean, again, going back with social media, one of the positive aspects of social media is networking, connecting with other authors, connecting with editors, connecting with cover artists, and so forth. It is a beautiful thing. I've made a lot of connections on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram being my main source because almost all the authors that I had featured on this show came from Instagram. It's just so incredible. And from those individual people, I have made my own team. I have an artist who makes cover art. I have an individual who is an editor. I have a person who is my marketing person, and so forth. And they're part of my team, and I'm always looking to expand. And I always try to give them shout out to whenever I can. Lori Ball, who's my editor, Tom Romaine, who is now my artist for my characters, and so many more. So, Mark, who are some people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way in this industry, whether it's fellow authors, editors, anyone in the publishing industry who has helped you along the way?
I actually make a list in my book on all of them. Laura Engelhart is a good friend and confidant that she's like a sounding board to me, which is invaluable because I will send her a list of names and I'll say, what do you think of these names? Does this sound evil? Does this sound, so we bounce back and forth. Lisa Wong has her own editing business, and she is the one that I told you she is my editor, more or less. So
Right.
she does fantastic. Let's see. Oh, Alyssa Weaver did the cover for The King's Ascent. Oh, I need to meet her in person because I need to give her a hug for that cover. I love that cover. So I am super excited to actually see that in print and hold it in my hand. So the list on there is quite extensive, and I cheat a little bit. I actually use my partner. She does my proofreading and she formats in vellum for me. So that's a money saving thing that we talked about earlier, how expensive it is. So you can get, say, $200 for a vellum program, and you can do all the work yourself, and it's fairly easy. And that'll save you, as opposed to spending nearly $1,000, depending on the length of your novel, $1,000, or even if it's 800, it may save you 800 from a proofreader because you only spent 200 and you can use that vellum repeatedly. So just any ways to save books. But anyway, so that's basically who I'm. Oh, and finally, Aubrey Green from Blue Clover Editing. She's a friend as well, and she's another sounding board that I use. So yeah, you're right. You definitely get your own little clique, if you will. You have your own little world, and try to stay with them, because that way, especially if you trust their opinion and you like their work, keep them forever.
Absolutely, 100%. And now we've arrived, Mark, at the final question of this incredible author's interview. So, with everything you've learned thus far about the industry, its highs and lows, your own struggles, and your accomplishment, everything you have learned also from your fellow friends in your own inner circle, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors and writers who want to begin in this industry?
I would say, and I think we've already actually said it, but I'll say it again, is find someone that you can trust and try to push all the rest of the noise out, because you will get a lot of bad advice as a beginner. You're gonna get a ton of bad advice. Find someone that you can trust outside of friends and family. Find someone you can trust, stick with them, and let them help you go through the journey together, because it's the only way. It's writing, again, like going back to earlier, it's something you have to learn. You must fail to learn, to grow. And by failing, that's draft number one, and then draft number two, and then draft number three. Every time you do a new version, you are making yourself better. And eventually, if you have guidance, you'll get there.
Definitely. And just as a final note to that, also, person I forgot to mention, and I will always give credit to her, is my good friend and fellow author, Kim Applegren. For those who don't know, Kim has been like one of my dearest close friends from the quarantine, even before, during after I graduated from college in 2018, and she and I have been by each other's side, from the get-go. We've been there for each other's high moments, and we've been there for each other during our low moments. So, exactly as Mark said, find someone that that's really going to be part of your tribe and stick with them, because they're going to be with you till the end of the road, now and forever. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to Mr. Mark McClain for coming on the show, telling us all about his books and what he has going forward. Mark, thank you again so much for coming on the show. Now, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and talk with you? And where can people buy copies of your books?
Well, first, before I get to any of that, thank you for having me. It was fun. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed being here. It was great.
Thank you.
And as far as the books themselves, Amazon is obviously one of the best places to look. You just have to make sure you put Mark K. McClain, because there is a Mark McClain out there who writes something totally different than mine. So Mark K. McClain, and the same goes for LinkedIn as well. And basically, LinkedIn is probably the only social media that I'm using right now. And so Amazon, or you can go to my website, which is simply nextjourneybooks.com. And everything is right there.
Awesome. I'll provide all those links down below in the description of this video. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for another author interview. And as I looked on my calendar, it is actually the last author interview for the month of February. But do not despair. I do have one final episode to wrap up the month of February. So until then, a huge thank you to Mark for coming on the show. I wish him the very best from one author to another. And thank you all, everyone, for joining me for, once again, another amazing interview. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.